Most people would have sold it before sunset. She did not. The storm arrived without warning. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains above Moonridge Pack, swallowing the afternoon sky and turning day into something that felt closer to twilight. Wind rushed through the towering pine trees with a mournful howl, bending branches and scattering leaves across the forest floor. Grace Carter pulled her worn blue cloak tighter around her shoulders as she hurried along the narrow trail. Rain had already begun falling in cold sheets, soaking her boots and darkening the edges of her sleeves. She should have headed home an hour earlier, but gathering medicinal herbs often took longer than expected. The older healers rarely shared their supplies with someone like Grace, which meant she had learned to find everything herself. The storm only made the task harder. A flash of lightning illuminated the forest for a brief second. Grace froze. Something silver reflected beneath the roots of a fallen oak tree several yards away. At first, she thought it was only a piece of metal carried into the woods by the storm. Yet something about it caught her attention. She carefully stepped closer. Rainwater streamed down the twisted roots as she knelt beside the massive tree. Half buried beneath mud and leaves rested an object unlike anything she had ever seen. Grace brushed away the dirt with trembling fingers. Her breath caught. It was a pendant, not an ordinary one. The chain appeared to be made from polished silver, and at its center hung an intricate wolf crest surrounded by symbols she did not recognize. Tiny gemstones lined the outer edge. Even beneath the dark storm clouds, the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Whoever owned it was important. Very important. Grace slowly lifted the pendant from the mud. It felt surprisingly heavy in her palm. Years of hardship had taught her the value of precious objects. One glance was enough to know this pendant could change her life. The silver alone would be worth a fortune. The gemstones could feed her family for years. Her stomach tightened. For a moment, she simply stared at it while rain continued falling around her. Images appeared in her mind uninvited. A warm house, new clothes, enough food for every winter. A life where she no longer worried about every coin she spent. The possibilities felt almost cruel, because opportunities like this never happened to people like Grace. A distant crack of thunder echoed through the valley. She lowered her eyes to the wolf crest again. The pendant did not feel like abandoned treasure. It felt personal, important, lost. Someone out there was probably searching for it. Someone was probably worried. Grace closed her fingers around the pendant and stood. The decision came quietly. Not because it was easy, because she already knew what felt right. By the time she reached the edge of Moonridge, the storm had intensified. Lanterns flickered through rain-covered windows. Villagers hurried through muddy streets seeking shelter from the weather. Grace stepped beneath the overhang of a small bakery and carefully examined the pendant once more beneath the lantern light. Her eyes widened. Near the back of the wolf crest was a tiny engraving almost hidden by the silver design. A crown above a wolf. Grace immediately recognized the symbol. Every member of the pack would. It belonged to the Alpha King. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked around the rainy street as though someone might suddenly appear to explain how such a thing had ended up buried beneath a tree. The Alpha King's pendant, lost somewhere in the forest, resting now in the hands of an Omega most of the pack barely noticed. Grace carefully tucked the pendant inside her cloak. The storm continued raging above Moonridge, but another kind of storm had already begun. She simply did not know it yet. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the rooftops of Moonridge, washing away every trace of the storm. Golden rays reflected from windows and cobblestone streets while merchants opened their shops and residents began another ordinary day. For Grace Carter, however, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The silver pendant rested safely inside a small wooden box beneath her bed. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wolf crest and royal crown engraved on its surface. The Alpha King's pendant. Somehow, the impossible had found its way into her hands. Grace lived in a modest cottage near the outer edge of the pack territory. The structure was small and aging, with weathered walls and a roof that required constant repairs. It was the kind of home most people walked past without noticing. Inside, she prepared breakfast for herself and her elderly aunt, who had raised her after her parents died years earlier. The meal consisted of simple bread and herbal tea. Money was always scarce. Every coin mattered. Her aunt noticed the distraction immediately. "You have been staring at the same piece of bread for 5 minutes," she said with a gentle smile. Grace hesitated before finally retrieving the pendant from her pocket. The older woman's eyes widened the moment she saw it. "Grace," she whispered, "where did you find that?" After hearing the story, her aunt sat silently for several moments. Then she sighed. Most people would sell it. Grace looked down. "I know, and no one would blame them." That part was true. Life in Moonridge had never been easy for lower-ranked Omegas. Grace worked harder than most and still struggled to afford basic necessities. Opportunities rarely came her way. Respect came even less often. Yet something about selling the pendant felt wrong. It belonged to someone. More importantly, it carried meaning. She could feel it. Later that afternoon, Grace visited the village market to purchase supplies. The pendant remained hidden beneath her cloak. She intended to ask discreet questions about its owner. Unfortunately, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long in Moonridge. By sunset, 3 different people had already learned about the pendant. By evening, nearly everyone seemed to know. Grace quickly discovered what people thought she should do with it. Sell it, a merchant told her. You would never have to worry about money again. Another villager laughed. If fate finally gives an Omega a gift, why return it? Others were less kind. Some suggested she was foolish. Others implied she was lying about finding it at all. A few openly accused her of trying to attract attention. Grace listened quietly and walked away. The comments hurt, but not because they surprised her. She had spent most of her life hearing similar things. What surprised her was how easily everyone assumed the answer was money. As darkness settled over Moonridge, Grace stood alone beside a small bridge crossing the river near the village center. The pendant rested in her palm, glowing softly beneath the lantern light. The silver wolf stared back at her. For a brief moment, she imagined selling it. The warm house, the security, the easier life. Then she closed her hand around it and shook her head. Some things were worth more than money. Somewhere in Moonridge, the Alpha King had lost something important. And whether anyone understood her decision or not, Grace knew exactly what she intended to do next. She was going to find him and return it, no matter what the rest of the pack thought. By the following morning, Grace Carter had made her decision. The pendant would be returned. What remained uncertain was how a forgotten Omega from the edge of Moonridge was supposed to reach the most powerful man in the kingdom. The answer, unfortunately, was not simple. The royal palace stood at the center of the capital district, protected by guards, advisors, and layers of protocol that ordinary pack members rarely crossed. Grace had never spoken to the Alpha King. She had only seen him from a distance during public ceremonies. Still, if the pendant truly belonged to him, she had to try. The morning air felt cool and fresh as she left her cottage carrying a small satchel. The pendant rested inside a cloth pouch hidden beneath her cloak. As she walked through the village, she noticed more people watching her than usual. News traveled quickly in Moonridge. Several villagers paused their conversations when she passed. Others openly stared. Some looked curious. Others looked amused. Grace kept walking. Near the market square, a voice called out to her. Still carrying that pendant? She turned and saw a merchant named Victor leaning against a produce stand. His smile carried the confidence of someone convinced he was offering good advice. "You know," he said, "my offer still stands. I can connect you with buyers from neighboring territories. You could make enough money to live comfortably for years." Grace shook her head. "It is not mine to sell." Victor laughed softly. "That is exactly why people stay poor." Several nearby shoppers chuckled in agreement. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but refused to argue. She simply continued walking. Deep down, she understood why people reacted this way. Most of them had spent their entire lives struggling. The idea of turning down such wealth seemed ridiculous. Yet every time she held the pendant, the same feeling returned. This was not an opportunity. It was a responsibility. By midday, Grace arrived at the town archives. If she hoped to reach the Alpha King, she first needed to learn more about the pendant itself. The archive building was small but filled with decades of pack history. Dusty books lined wooden shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. An elderly archivist named Harold greeted her with mild surprise. Few people visited unless they needed official records. Grace carefully described the pendant and its wolf crest. Harold frowned thoughtfully before disappearing between the shelves. Several minutes later, he returned carrying an old leather-bound volume. Together, they examined pages detailing the symbols of Moonridge's ruling family. Grace's heart skipped when she saw an illustration nearly identical to the engraving on the pendant. A silver wolf beneath a royal crown. "There is no mistake," Harold said quietly. "This belongs to the Blackwood bloodline." Grace stared at the image. The realization made the situation feel even larger than before. This was not simply valuable jewelry. It was part of the Alpha King's family history. Harold adjusted his glasses and continued reading. According to these records, certain heirlooms are passed from one generation of rulers to the next. Grace listened carefully. Every word strengthened her resolve. If the pendant carried generations of meaning, returning it was the only choice she could live with. As she left the archives later that afternoon, the palace towers could be seen in the distance beyond the city center. Sunlight reflected from their stone walls. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to consider what would happen when she arrived there. The thought made her nervous. People like her did not simply walk into royal palaces. Yet the pendant remained safely hidden beneath her cloak, and with every step, she felt more certain of one thing. Tomorrow, she would go to the palace gates. Whatever happened after that would be up to fate. The palace gates were even more intimidating than Grace Carter had imagined. Two enormous stone towers rose above the entrance, their banners fluttering in the morning breeze. Guards stood watch in polished uniforms while nobles, merchants, and officials passed through the gates with practiced confidence. Grace paused at the bottom of the wide staircase leading toward the entrance. For a brief moment, doubt whispered in her ear. Perhaps the villagers had been right. Perhaps someone like her had no business coming here. Then she felt the familiar weight of the pendant hidden beneath her cloak. She straightened her shoulders and continued forward. The first guard noticed her immediately. His eyes traveled from her worn boots to her simple cloak. Whatever conclusion he reached was obvious from the faint smile that appeared on his face. "Can I help you?" he asked. The question sounded polite, but the amusement beneath it was impossible to miss. Grace nodded. "I need to speak with someone from the royal household." The second guard exchanged a glance with his companion. "About what?" Grace hesitated. She did not want to reveal the pendant in front of strangers. "I have something important that belongs to the Alpha King." The first guard laughed. Not loudly, just enough to draw attention from several people nearby. "Of course you do." A pair of passing merchants slowed their pace. One of them smirked openly. Grace felt her face grow warm but refused to leave. "I am serious." The second guard folded his arms. "And what exactly makes you think the Alpha King has time to meet every person who claims to have something important?" More laughter followed. Several people standing near the entrance began watching the exchange. Grace could feel their eyes on her. The familiar feeling returned. The feeling of being judged before she had even spoken. Yet she remained where she was. "Please," she said quietly. "If someone from the palace would simply look at what I found, they would understand." The guards appeared unconvinced. One of them shook his head. "The Alpha King is currently occupied with matters that concern the entire pack. He is not available." Grace swallowed her disappointment. The journey had taken hours. The courage had taken even longer. She had known this might happen. Still, hearing the refusal hurt more than she expected. Nearby conversations resumed. People began losing interest. To them, she was simply another Omega standing where she did not belong. Most would have walked away. Grace almost did. Then her fingers brushed against the cloth pouch beneath her cloak. She remembered the wolf crest, the family history, the responsibility. She had accepted the moment she picked the pendant up from the forest floor. She slowly moved toward a stone bench across from the gate and sat down. The guards watched her with mild confusion. One finally called out, "What are you doing?" Grace looked toward the palace entrance. "Waiting." The guard laughed again. "For how long?" Grace's answer surprised even herself. "As long as it takes." Hours passed. The morning became afternoon. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Nobles entered and exited the palace. Advisors hurried across the courtyard carrying documents. Servants moved supplies through side entrances. Through it all, Grace remained on the bench. She ignored the curious stares and whispered comments. The pendant stayed safely hidden beneath her cloak. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, casting golden light across the palace walls, something unexpected happened. The massive front doors opened. Conversations throughout the courtyard suddenly quieted. A familiar figure stepped outside. Tall, confident, dressed in black and silver. The Alpha King himself had just entered the courtyard. And for the first time all day, fate finally looked in Grace Carter's direction. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faded into silence as the Alpha King descended the palace steps, surrounded by advisors and royal guards. Nathaniel Blackwood carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Every movement appeared effortless. Every glance commanded attention. Grace had seen him only from a distance before, yet standing here now, she immediately understood why the entire pack respected him. The setting sun cast golden light across the courtyard as he moved toward a waiting carriage near the entrance. For a moment, Grace thought the opportunity had already slipped away. There were too many people, too much distance, too many reasons for someone like her to remain invisible. Then one of the guards who had mocked her earlier stepped forward and spoke quietly to a palace official. The official looked toward the stone bench where Grace sat. His expression shifted with mild annoyance. Seconds later, the message reached Nathaniel himself. The Alpha King paused. He turned. His eyes moved across the courtyard before settling directly on Grace. She felt her heartbeat quicken. Everything suddenly seemed very quiet. Nathaniel spoke briefly with the official before changing direction. Instead of continuing toward the carriage, he began walking toward her. The crowd watched with growing curiosity. Grace slowly rose to her feet. By the time Nathaniel stopped in front of her, dozens of people were openly staring. The Alpha King's expression remained calm and unreadable. "I am told you have been waiting here since morning," he said. His voice was steady and surprisingly gentle. Grace nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." Nathaniel glanced toward the palace gates and then back at her. "For what reason?" Grace carefully reached beneath her cloak. Several nearby guards immediately tensed. She ignored them and removed the small cloth pouch. Opening it carefully, she revealed the silver pendant resting inside her palm. The moment Nathaniel saw it, something changed. The calm expression vanished. Not dramatically, just enough for Grace to notice. His eyes fixed on the pendant. The courtyard disappeared around him. For several long seconds, he simply stared. Then he reached forward and lifted the pendant with remarkable care. The silver wolf crest caught the fading sunlight. Nathaniel's fingers tightened slightly around the chain. Grace saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not surprise, not relief. Something deeper, something personal. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. Grace explained everything. The storm, the fallen tree, the forest trail. Nathaniel listened without interruption. The crowd remained silent. Even the guards appeared uncertain now. When she finished, Nathaniel lowered his gaze to the pendant once more. A faint smile touched his face, though it carried sadness as well. "I have been searching for this for years," he said. Murmurs immediately spread through the courtyard. Years. Grace blinked in surprise. She had assumed the pendant had been lost recently. Nathaniel looked at the wolf crest. "This belonged to my mother." The words landed softly, yet their impact echoed through everyone listening. The courtyard grew even quieter. Grace suddenly understood why the pendant had felt so important. It was not simply royal jewelry. It was a memory, a connection, a piece of family history. Nathaniel carefully closed his hand around it. For the first time, genuine warmth appeared in his expression. "You could have sold this." Grace nodded. "I know. You could have become wealthy. Perhaps." Nathaniel studied her face. "Yet you returned it." Grace hesitated before answering. "Because it belonged to someone else." The silence that followed felt different. Respectful. Thoughtful. Nathaniel looked at her for several seconds before slowly nodding. Around them, the crowd waited for the Alpha King's response. Most expected a simple thank you. Perhaps a small reward. Instead, Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on Grace Carter, and something about the way he looked at her suggested that this story was far from over. Grace expected the meeting to end there. The pendant had been returned. The Alpha King had recovered a treasured family heirloom. In her mind, the matter was settled. Yet as the crowd slowly began whispering among themselves, Nathaniel Blackwood remained standing in front of her. His attention never left her face. It was not the look of a ruler examining a subject. It was the look of a man trying to understand something rare. Finally, he turned toward one of his advisors. "Have someone escort Miss Carter home safely." The advisor nodded immediately. Grace opened her mouth to protest. "That is not necessary, Your Majesty." Nathaniel offered a faint smile. "After waiting an entire day to return something that most people would have sold, I believe it is." Several nearby nobles exchanged surprised glances. Grace noticed them immediately. The Alpha King was being courteous to an Omega. Apparently, that alone was enough to attract attention. Before she could respond, Nathaniel gave a respectful nod and departed with his advisors. The crowd gradually dispersed, though many continued glancing back at her. By the time Grace finally returned to her cottage that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her aunt listened carefully as she described everything that had happened. When Grace finished, the older woman simply smiled. "You did the right thing." Grace nodded. Yet something about the encounter lingered in her thoughts long after sunset. Not because she expected a reward. Quite the opposite. The Alpha King's reaction had felt sincere, personal, as though the pendant meant far more than anyone realized. Meanwhile, inside the royal palace, Nathaniel sat alone in his private study. The pendant rested on the desk before him. Candlelight reflected across the silver wolf crest. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Memories surfaced that he had not revisited in years. His mother's laughter. Her advice. The day she had placed the pendant in his hands and told him that leadership was measured by character rather than power. He had searched for the pendant countless times after it disappeared during a hunting expedition years earlier. Eventually, he accepted that it was gone forever. Yet somehow it had found its way back to him through the honesty of a young woman who possessed every reason to keep it. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." His most trusted advisor stepped inside. Nathaniel gestured toward a chair. "Tell me about Grace Carter." The advisor looked surprised. "There is not much to tell, Your Majesty." "Then find out more." By the next afternoon, reports began arriving. Nathaniel read each one carefully. Grace lived modestly. She cared for her elderly aunt. She gathered herbs and assisted neighbors when they were sick. More interestingly, several witnesses confirmed that merchants had offered substantial sums for the pendant. She had refused every offer. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Most people would have accepted. Many nobles he knew would have accepted. Yet Grace had chosen differently. Another report mentioned the ridicule she faced while waiting outside the palace gates. Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. She had remained there for nearly an entire day despite being dismissed and mocked. Not because she hoped to gain something. Because she believed returning the pendant was the right thing to do. The realization stayed with him throughout the evening. Outside his window, the lights of Moonridge shimmered beneath the night sky. Inside the palace, Nathaniel found himself thinking less about the pendant and more about the woman who had returned it. Somewhere beyond the city, Grace Carter had resumed her ordinary life. What she did not know was that the Alpha King had begun paying attention. And once Nathaniel Blackwood became interested in something, he rarely forgot it. Grace Carter quickly discovered that attention could be far more uncomfortable than invisibility. During the days that followed, life in Moonridge appeared normal on the surface. She continued gathering herbs in the forest. She visited the market. She cared for her aunt. Yet everywhere she went, people seemed to be watching. Some offered polite smiles. Others whispered the moment she walked past. The story of the pendant had spread far beyond the village. What surprised Grace was how differently people interpreted it. A few admired her decision. Many did not. One afternoon, while purchasing supplies in the market square, she overheard two women speaking near a fruit stand. Neither realized she was close enough to hear. "No one waits outside a palace all day without expecting something in return," one said. Her companion nodded immediately. Exactly. She knew what she was doing. Grace continued walking without reacting, but the words stayed with her. Similar conversations followed throughout the week. Some people suggested she had deliberately sought the Alpha King's attention. Others claimed she hoped to gain status through the encounter. The rumors grew larger each day. The truth remained remarkably simple. She had returned something that did not belong to her. Yet simple truths often struggled to compete with exciting gossip. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Nathaniel Blackwood continued reviewing reports regarding Grace. The more he learned, the more confused he became by the opinions circulating throughout Moonridge. None of the accusations matched the facts. Every account described the same person, a young Omega who helped neighbors without seeking recognition, a woman who regularly shared herbs with families who could not afford medicine, someone who consistently placed honesty above personal gain. Late one evening, Nathaniel stood beside a window overlooking the city. His advisor entered carrying another stack of reports. "More complaints?" Nathaniel asked. The advisor sighed. Mostly speculation from nobles who dislike the attention she is receiving. Nathaniel accepted the documents. Several came from influential families. Their concerns were nearly identical. They questioned why an Omega was suddenly being discussed throughout the pack. Some implied she had manipulated circumstances to earn favor. Nathaniel closed the folder and set it aside. Did any of them mention the fact that she returned an heirloom worth a fortune? The advisor remained silent. That answer was enough. Across Moonridge, the annual Harvest Festival was approaching. It was the largest public celebration of the year. Merchants traveled from neighboring territories. Families filled the capital streets. The entire pack gathered to celebrate another successful season. Preparations had already begun throughout the city. Banners appeared along major roads. Musicians rehearsed performances in public squares. Excitement filled the air. Grace looked forward to the festival for one reason only. It offered a welcome distraction from the rumors. She hoped that once enough time passed, people would lose interest and move on to something else. Unfortunately, fate seemed to have different plans. 2 days before the festival, a royal messenger arrived at her cottage carrying an official invitation sealed with the crest of the Alpha King. Grace stared at the document in disbelief. Her aunt read it twice before looking up with equally wide eyes. The invitation requested her presence at the Harvest Festival's central ceremony. No explanation was provided. No details were included. Only a date, a time, and the royal seal. By sunset, news of the invitation had already spread across Moonridge. The rumors exploded overnight. And somewhere inside the palace, Nathaniel Blackwood finalized a decision that would soon leave the entire pack speechless. The Harvest Festival arrived beneath clear autumn skies. From sunrise onward, Moonridge seemed transformed. Colorful banners stretched across every major street. Musicians filled public squares with lively melodies. Merchants displayed handcrafted goods while children ran between crowded market stalls laughing and chasing one another. Yet despite all the excitement, one topic dominated nearly every conversation. Grace Carter. By mid-morning, thousands of pack members had gathered in the capital. Rumors traveled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Some believed the Alpha King planned to reward Grace with gold. Others insisted he intended to offer her a position within the royal household. A few claimed the entire invitation had been a misunderstanding. No one knew the truth. Grace stood near the edge of the massive central square, trying to ignore the stares directed her way. She wore her cleanest blue dress and a simple cloak. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Yet people looked at her differently now. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion, others with open disbelief. Her aunt stood beside her offering quiet reassurance. "Whatever happens," she said gently, "remember who you are." Grace nodded. She needed the reminder. The enormous stage at the center of the square had been decorated with silver banners bearing the crest of Moonridge. Rows of officials, advisors, and nobles occupied reserved seating near the front. As the ceremony began, speakers addressed the crowd one after another. They celebrated the year's achievements, honored community leaders, and recognized contributions made throughout the pack. Grace listened politely while wondering why she had been invited. Hours seemed to pass. Then everything changed. A royal herald stepped forward. His voice echoed across the square. "By decree of Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood, there is one final matter to be addressed." The crowd immediately quieted. Even the musicians stopped playing. The herald unrolled a scroll. "Grace Carter is requested to come forward." A wave of whispers swept through the gathering. Grace felt her stomach tighten. Every eye in the square seemed to follow her as she slowly approached the stage. She could hear murmurs all around her. Questions, speculation, confusion. When she reached the platform, Nathaniel himself stepped forward. Unlike previous ceremonies, he wore no ceremonial crown. His expression remained calm and serious. Grace stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. The square became completely silent. Nathaniel turned toward the crowd. His voice carried clearly through the autumn air. "Several weeks ago, a young woman found something precious." Many people nodded. They knew this part of the story. Nathaniel continued. "She could have sold it. She could have kept it. She could have changed her life with a single decision." His gaze shifted briefly toward Grace. Instead, she chose honesty. The crowd remained silent. Nathaniel slowly removed the silver pendant from beneath his coat. Sunlight reflected from the wolf crest. Gasps immediately spread through the square. "This heirloom belonged to my mother," he said. "I searched for it for years." Grace felt her heart pound. Nathaniel's voice grew stronger. "Many people speak about loyalty. Many people speak about integrity. Few demonstrate it when given the opportunity to benefit themselves." The silence deepened. Across the square, nobles exchanged uncertain looks. Advisors watched attentively. Ordinary citizens leaned forward. Everyone sensed that something unusual was happening. Nathaniel stepped closer to Grace. His expression remained completely sincere. "Today, I intend to recognize a quality more valuable than wealth, status, or power." The entire pack waited. No one knew what he would do next. And in the next few moments, Moonridge would witness something that would be discussed for years to come. The silence stretched across the square like a held breath. Thousands of people stood motionless beneath the autumn sky. Nobles, merchants, guards, elders, and ordinary pack members all waited for the Alpha King's next words. Grace Carter stood at the center of it all, uncertain why her heart was beating so fast. Nathaniel Blackwood looked out across the crowd before returning his attention to her. The silver pendant remained in his hand, reflecting sunlight in brief flashes of gold and silver. "For weeks," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "I have listened to people discuss Grace Carter." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Some claimed she sought attention. Some claimed she expected rewards. Others questioned her motives entirely. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nathaniel continued, "So I investigated for myself." The square grew silent again. Grace blinked in surprise. She had not known that. "I learned that she lives modestly. I learned that she helps others when she has little to spare herself. I learned that merchants offered enough money to change her future." He raised the pendant slightly. "And I learned that she refused every offer." The words echoed through the square. Faces throughout the crowd began changing. Some people looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. Nathaniel took another step forward. "Integrity is often praised when it costs nothing." His gaze swept across the audience. "Its true value appears when honesty demands sacrifice." Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She had never expected public recognition. She certainly had not expected this. Then something happened that no one anticipated. Nathaniel handed the pendant to a nearby attendant. Slowly and deliberately, he stepped directly in front of Grace. Confusion spread throughout the square. The crowd leaned forward. Even the advisors appeared uncertain. Then the Alpha King lowered his head. It was not a dramatic movement. It was not theatrical. It was simple, respectful, genuine. Yet the effect was immediate. Gasps erupted from every corner of the square. Thousands of people stared in disbelief. The most powerful man in Moonridge had just bowed to an Omega. Complete silence followed. Grace stood frozen. She could scarcely believe what she was seeing. Nathaniel raised his head and spoke calmly. "Today, I honor a woman whose character proved stronger than temptation." His voice remained steady. "Not because she is wealthy. Not because she holds rank. Not because she possesses power." He looked directly at Grace. "Because she chose what was right when no one would have blamed her for choosing otherwise." Many people throughout the crowd lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Some who had mocked Grace days earlier suddenly seemed unable to meet her gaze. Nathaniel turned toward the gathering once more. Moonridge should never measure worth by status alone. The statement hung in the air. A kingdom becomes stronger when it recognizes integrity wherever it is found. Applause began somewhere near the back of the square. Then another voice joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Grace felt tears fill her eyes. Not because of the attention, not because of the recognition, because for the first time in her life, people were seeing her for who she truly was. Her aunt stood among the crowd, smiling through tears of her own. Nathaniel offered Grace a small, sincere smile. No promises were made. No grand declarations followed. Yet something had changed. Not only for Grace, but for Moonridge itself. As golden leaves drifted through the afternoon air and the applause continued rolling across the square, Grace realized that returning the pendant had never been about changing her life. It had been about doing the right thing. And somehow, that choice had changed everything.